There are two types of data that exist in statistics: quantitative or numerical data and qualitative data. So let's have a look at them one by one. So quantitative data, those are the measurements that are recorded on a naturally occurring numerical scale. So those are just numerical values like temperature, unemployment rate, GDP, grades, number of voters, accidents, age, etc. Whereas qualitative or categorical data, those are the measurements that cannot be measured on a natural numerical scale. They can only be classified into one of a group of categories. For example, gender, right? We cannot calculate this. We can only split into some categories like male, female, and others. The same with race, right? We cannot calculate race. We can only split into different races. The same with political party affiliation. It cannot be calculated. People can only be split, like in this example, into three groups: Democrat, Republican, and Independent. Defective status, right? We cannot calculate it, but we can say whether the item is defective or not. Size of a car, whether it is subcompact, compact, mid-size, or full size, and some other examples. So, as a statistician, you might need at some point to collect data. And there are three ways to do that. We can collect data from a published source like books, journal, newspapers. So this is what is available to us from external resources, or we can design an experiment, or we can do an observational study. So a design experiment is a data collection method where the researcher exerts full control over the characteristics of the experimental unit sampled. These experiments typically involve a group of experimental units that are assigned to the treatment and untreated or control group. So this is a type of experiment that is very often used by medical students or by scientists who study biology or chemistry. So not that much relevant for economists, whereas observational study, this is something that is more relevant for us. This is a data collection method where the experimental units sampled are observed in their natural setting. No attempt is made to control the characteristics of the experimental unit sample. And an example of such study includes opinion polls and surveys. So when you ask people whether they agree on a certain issue or not, so this is an observational study. And this is something that you will also do throughout your studies, not during this course, but at some point you will do that. So, and you will note that what you're doing is an observational study. So I've already mentioned that in statistics, we deal with samples. Yeah, right. We would like to analyze the whole population, but because it's almost impossible to have access to the whole population, we usually have only a sample. And we would like this sample to be as representative as possible. So in other words, we would like this sample to be as close as possible to the target population. And what I mean by as close as possible is as close as possible in terms of its characteristics. Therefore, it is very important to make sure that your sample is properly collected and that there are no issues that I mentioned here. For example, that you don't commit a selection bias. That means when results, and this selection bias results when some experimental units in the population have less chance of being included in the sample than others. This results in samples that are not representative of the population. So when, for example, you try to analyze the behavior of, let's say, a student at Lazarsky, so you would like to know, for example, what they think about the coffee shop they've got, and instead of collecting the data over students, you, for example, ask the faculty. So your sample will not be representative of the Lazarsky student population, but it will be rather representative of the faculty population. Another problem is non-response bias. So you might fail to obtain a representative sample when a non-response bias arises. So this is a type of selection bias that results when data on all experimental units in a sample are not collected. So, and this usually happens with surveys, especially online surveys, when a person has a choice whether to answer or not to answer, or not to respond to your questionnaire. And because of that, some people, actually a lot of people, tend not to respond to questionnaires, and a non-response bias arises. And another mistake that you might make, especially at the beginning of this course, is a so-called measurement error when inaccuracies in the values of data collected arise. So when you make just a simple, let's say, mathematical mistake in calculating a certain statistical value.